This episode is made possible by our generous patrons.
Welcome to the Ink Film Podcast, where we read the book
And then see the movie.
I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss Stephen King's 1983 horror novel, Pet Sematary. Back with another Stephen King project. This is our third one. We did The Shining, and we started this whole thing with It.
It's weird because I feel like we've done another one too. But
I don't think so.
We're going back to the well. Back to the old Stephen King well.
There's plenty of them out there to do, and I'm sure we will. Actually, I know for a fact we're going to be revisiting It later this year, right? When the It Part 2 comes out. We're going to do the mini-series, I think is the plan, as an episode before we go see It Part 2. That was like a refresher.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be fun. Stephen King's writing is always like, it feels like you're reading something in the same universe. So when like theories started coming out that everything's connected, you could really see that, because it does feel like a story that takes place in the same world as It or The Shining.
Well, I mean, it definitely does. Like, there's mention of Derry, Maine in this story. I don't know if you caught, there's one part where the character talks about a Saint Bernard that killed 4 people.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, that's a reference to Cujo.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I did not catch that.
Yeah. So he references, he refers to his other books in these.
What's crazy is that the biggest one that popped up for me was when he shouted out his own adaptation of his novel.
When did you say that?
Somebody was like, "Do you want to go play tennis with me this afternoon?" And he was like, "Yeah, maybe. I guess I will." And he's like, "Come on, man. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy."
I don't remember that part.
Yeah, it was crazy. I wrote it down because I was freaking out.
Okay. I don't know how I missed that. I remember that part where they're talking about playing stuff. So anyway, we're kind of, this is kind of a weird start. Yeah, we're doing Pet Sematary. We're going to go see the movie in a couple weeks here. I'm excited to see it. It's getting some good reviews early on. But yeah, I want to know what your experience is with this novel and this movie. Like, I know there's an older movie, so.
I remember this being like really hyped up for me as a kid as like the scariest movie and scariest book. Mm-hmm. And I saw it and read it too early. I was too young to have read and viewed the movie.
You read this book? You read this book?
Yeah, I've read this book. I read this book in 8th grade probably.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So you are more knowledgeable about this material than I am.
Well, this movie fucked me up. This story, it really messed me up. I saw the movie before that. So I saw the movie probably like 5th, 6th grade, maybe even before that. And then, I read the book eventually in like 8th grade, because I was going through like this phase of like, I want to read like scary. I want to read everything. Mm-hmm. So I went and grabbed a Stephen King novel, and it was Pet Sematary. And I honestly, I feel like I suppressed a lot of this story. Like, reading it now, I think, I don't know, it affected me back then more than I was willing to admit, even in my modern day sensibilities. And rereading it is kind of interesting, because I always, I don't know, I got a little jaded about the story and felt like it was just about the pets. Like, I remembered it as being about the pets, and it's not really about the pets. It's about some other stuff.
It's about a lot more than that. Yeah, that's something I'm definitely picking up on as more savvy adult reader now. There's a lot of really heady, interesting themes about death and about burial and how our society handles death and deals with sort of the grimy facts of death that people want to ignore. And this book like tries to engage with that stuff.
It was a bummer too. Like, as it was just death. It just talks about death
a lot,
nonstop.
Yeah.
It's just all about death, basically.
That's what this whole book's about. And yeah, man, it really it brought up a lot of stuff for me, and I really had a pretty powerful reaction reading it. For my own personal experience with it, I saw this movie when I was really young, and I don't think I watched the whole thing because I don't remember much about it other than a few scenes. Mm-hmm. And those scenes like stuck with me. Like, there's a couple of pretty dramatic scenes in the movie that stuck with me. And I honestly think what happened was I saw some of those scenes and they upset me, and then I stopped watching. because I have no memory of like what happened with the rest of it, you know?
Yeah, that reminds me of something I wanted to say about the original movie is that when I watched it, there were scary parts that I definitely stuck with me, but all in all, I think even then I walked away from the movie feeling like it wasn't that scary. Like I walked away being like, oh, it was a scary movie, and there were scary parts that I definitely didn't want to see again. You know what I mean? Like, I guess maybe I was just a kid wanting to not think that it was that scary.
Right.
But ultimately, I didn't remember this as a very scary movie. I remembered it as, like, unsettling and, like, maybe some of that.
Well, it's because scary is such a hard thing to quantify. King talks about this in his opening to this book, Some, where he talks about why he thinks of it as the scariest novel, or most frightening novel, I think is actually what he says. But yeah, I mean, because I think especially as a kid, you know, there's like identifiable things that are scary. It's like stuff that makes you have like, there's like jump scares, right? There's like a big monster that you look at it and go, that thing's scary. And then there's like the subtler stuff where it just is like creepy or it makes you think about it, keeps you up at night. You know, that kind of stuff is a different kind of scary. And I feel like as a kid, maybe you're going to like recognize that less and you're going to focus more on like, was there a big scary monster? Did it make me have jump scares? Like that kind of stuff. Because that's easier to identify.
I think that's exactly what it was. Yeah.
And that's going to affect everybody differently. Like some people like that's scarier to them than the other thing and like creepy, like, unsettling themes, like that's not going to hit everybody the same way. Cause some people won't find the same thing creepy, or they'll be like, they'll just be able to shrug it off and it won't bother them.
I think what it is some people, if it's not like blatant, some people will shrug it off and not engage with it. They'll just be like, that wasn't scary, and then not really think too much into it in order to keep it from being too scary.
And I think for this one, for me at least, it's like I have a lot of experience with like losing pets and losing people, and when you have that, you bring that to the story, and then it comes to you, and then you have this mutual ground where you're talking about some similar stuff. Whereas if you don't have that in your background, then I feel like you're not going to connect with it in the same way.
Right. And I think that's part of what I'm talking about is coming to it as an adult, having at least experienced or being able to empathize with that. Whereas as a kid, you're just so young and invincible, and you think nothing's ever going to happen, and so you don't engage with like people or pets dying as much.
Yeah. And so this kind of like taboo subject matter also to me connects really well with King's writing style, because I love his attention to detail. I've talked about it in our other mini episodes we've done about him, but it just really stood out to me how well he is able to find just like the detail that like is taboo to talk about in a situation. You know, like no one talks about that thing, and like he talks about it, you know, and I don't know, just that taboo nature makes it also feel real. It makes it feel like he's not holding any punches back, right? He's going for it all the way, and so you're getting this, You're
reminding me of the scene that happened that when I read it, I was like, what the hell is he doing? And it was basically like there's a lot of sex in this book, and there was a sex scene, and he was talking about how like during sex with his wife, he was like his mind was wandering and he kept thinking about the dead cat, and he was really thinking about like the death while he was also having sex with his wife. Yeah. So it was just like a funny thing that like, you know, humans are weird things, you know what I mean? Like we're not in control always of like where our mind goes. So in a situation like that, usually if you're writing a sex scene, you're not going to jump to something like that. Yeah. But realistically, you can see something like that happening in somebody's mind where like they're having sex with someone and then like something shoots in their mind and they're like still having sex with the person, but their mind's elsewhere, thinking about something like death, which is like, just, I don't know. I think that's like something that King was trying to...
Right. Like, and it's taboo to talk about. Right. You know, it's even hard. Sometimes it feels weird, even us bringing it up on the podcast. It's so taboo.
It was weird. When I was reading it, it was weird. And like, I noticed that, you know?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too, because he does talk about how in the introduction, he feels like this novel is in some ways problematic. And I agree with that. I think there's a few things that stand out to me, and I'm sure there are more that I am maybe not sensitive to and I missed. And maybe I'll find more in the second half. Which, by the way, we didn't say. This is just going to be for the first half of the novel. That's all we've read. We have not finished this novel. And the first half is actually part 1 of 3. Just half. It's roughly half, like, page-wise. But the point I was trying to make, a couple problematic things. I don't know if we just want to talk about them at the top. And then we can get into it. But I think a lot of his thoughts about the neutering of his cat is really wrong-headed. I think he puts this little thing out where he's like, oh, it wasn't some macho bullshit. I actually thought this stuff. But like, it totally is.
Right.
All the stuff he's describing is exactly the reason that there's a lot of macho assholes out there who won't spay or neuter their pets, or specifically neuter their male dogs or cats. And it's a lot of this like testosterone bullshit of like, oh, it's gonna make them less of a real animal, and it's gonna make them all this stuff. And like, he goes on to like hit on those points multiple times throughout the novel, and I just found myself cringing every time because I don't know. To me, it's like it's this is a really bad idea to have out there in the world, and it makes me sad to think about how many people might have read this book and then decided to not neuter their pets, and then you get the mass proliferation of strays that die every day and kill shelters and all that stuff. So anyway, it's just that was frustrating. And then the Indian burial grounds I think is inherently pretty problematic. There's a lot of this is something that we touched on a little bit with King, that he does this a lot, and he did in the past at least, where he connects like Native American stuff to being magical and mystical and exotic and othering. It's very othering of that other society, and makes them seem like they're not people. It makes them seem like they're these mystical people, beings that had connections to, I don't know. And it's like, it's in some ways it's okay, and then in other ways it's not okay. So it's going to depend on how sensitive you are to it too, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree with you're otherizing people by saying that, they did ritualistic burials, and then using that as like the crux, the ritualistic burial, using that and like their culture as the crux for the story, and having it be like magical, and the way that things become monstrous and like a curse, maybe something like that, just seems to me like white,
it's
a
wrong,
bunch of white
pagan,
people, right? Yeah. A bunch of white Christians, specifically Christians, they talk about a lot in this story, which I wanted to talk to you about with King, how he engages with religion, but just the way that he basically is like, these people are normal, they're white and they're Christian, and then the Native Americans and their burial grounds and their rituals are black magic and scary and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And that dichotomy is inherently problematic.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, we're recognizing that, but I think this story has a lot to offer, otherwise, and I was able to look past it, which speaks to my privilege and where I'm at, being a white person myself. But I was able to enjoy this story regardless. Before we get into it, we are going to be doing a bonus episode for our patrons. It's going to be the short story Lucero, which was written by Andy Weir and is a canonical short story for Ready Player One. We'll get into the story behind like how that happened on the bonus episode, and I think we talk about it a little bit on our Ready Player One coverage. But yeah, we're gonna get into that. We're gonna release that as a bonus episode. If you want to find out how you can listen to that, go to patreon.com/ink2film. It should be coming out in like the next week or so, right?
Right. Yes, I'm excited to get into that one because I honestly have no idea. I haven't read anything about it. I just know that what we've talked about in our Ready Player One coverage, that's all I know of it. So I'm excited.
I think it's about Sorrento. So that's all.
Other than that, I don't know. Yeah. So it'll be cool to jump into that because it's like Andy Weir obviously wasn't the original writer of Ready Player One. So for him for what was the writer's name?
Ernest Cline.
Him to acknowledge the story as canon is pretty cool. So it'll be interesting to see like how another author approached that world.
So yeah, you can look for that. So with other authors, we've often delved into their backgrounds and their biographies. For King, it's like, I think what we've started to do is talk about the backstory for the particular novel that we're discussing, because there's so much out there about him. So for this one, I read you said you also had an introduction where it talked about like how he came up with the story and what was the story seed, which I find that kind of stuff fascinating. But in case the listener isn't familiar, basically, King was invited to become the writer in residence at the University of Maine in, I think it was 1979. And while he was there, he rented this house, and it was in sort of rural Maine nearby, and very similar to the one that the Lewis Creed and his family move into. And while he was there, it was right next to this big, like it's a small road, but it had big trucks that would go flying by on it, right? Mm-hmm. And he basically talked to people in the surrounding area, and they told him that like pets die all the time on this road, and to be careful with his own pet. And then sure enough, his pet, which is named Smucky, his daughter's cat, got run over and was killed on this highway while he was there. And there was also a pet cemetery, a local pet cemetery that he found out about, and he went to and visited, and it was spelled it had the same misspelling that is now the title of this book, with the S, which I think that's just a really cool detail.
It is.
So there's a lot of these details that go right into the book.
Yeah, the cemetery thing. Because I read this book, 7th, 8th grade, I didn't know how to spell cemetery for a while because of the book.
It got you, man.
It got me. He tricked me. I wasn't an advanced enough reader to know that he was playing a trick. It's a cool detail because it really makes it feel like if children were to have a cemetery, they would definitely misspell it, and then the townsfolk would leave it, because it's like a nice little thing.
Yeah, it reminds me of like Inglourious Bastards with that misspelling from the Tarantino movie.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's referencing something in world, not the like official spelling of something.
Right.
So that's cool. So a couple other details. His daughter had a moment where she was like really upset about her cat, obviously, and she said like, what why does God need my cat? He can have his own cat or whatever. And King put that detail right into the book. We see Ellie having it saying almost identically the same thing about her cat. Although her cat hadn't died at that point, but still it was very similar. And then Owen, specifically Owen King, was crawling towards the road or walking towards the road, and King remembers running over and stopping him, and he can't remember if he actually what was it? If he actually like got there in time, or if he tripped, or what happened. But he was able to stop him somehow. And then like a truck went by, and it was like a near thing to like Owen almost getting hit by a truck too. And so obviously that affected this novel quite a bit too.
I think that my favorite part about the foreword is everything from what we've just talked about. How he talks about his struggle with thinking of the alternate scenario where his kid is hit by the truck, and then like the ensuing grief, and he like going down that path as a writer and deciding like what, obviously I don't know if he's saying he would do everything that's happening to Lewis, but just the idea that the writer's saying he's going down a dark place because he's like, my son dies, then what do I do? Yeah. And there's a cemetery. To me, I understand why he's saying it's his scariest, because I can't, like, in all of the rest of his novels, he's not actively thinking about his kid dying before him and what he would do to make sure that kid wasn't actually gone.
Yeah.
And
in some ways, it's like maybe he's saying it's his most upsetting novel personally to him.
And that's, I think he verbatim says that, basically.
Yeah,
in the
and so, is that frightening? Is that upsetting? Is that different? I don't know. But he did talk about how he showed this novel to people and it upset them, I think close friends and family. Mm-hmm. And he ended up putting it in a drawer for a few years before showing it to an editor, I think, who helped him with it and get it to a point where they wanted to publish it. And so we almost didn't get this novel. This was almost a trunked novel.
Yeah, that is amazing. And to think that like I just wanted to think about how tortured he must have been by the material to be like, you pour so much time into developing a novel and having it be fully realized. I guess he's the type of guy who pumps out a book pretty quickly, but
oh man,
but
I want to touch on that, but finish your thought.
the idea that he wrote this and then was like, you know what, I put all this effort into it, but it's so troubling to me personally, I'm just going to put it in a drawer, is pretty wild. And to touch on the fact that we almost never got it, he was changing representation, I think, or something like that, and basically he owed one last book to his old publishing company or someone like that, and the only one he had on hand was Pet Sematary, and he showed it to, I think he said he showed it to his wife, and then his wife was like, yeah, show it to them. And then that's when, because just imagine her,
Tabitha King,
her also seeing this scenario play out, like thinking about how the story seed and knowing like her children, if her children had died, and it must have been really, really intense.
Yeah, and it's like there's a quote in On Writing where he says something about like, stop worrying about what other people are going to think of you. If you want to be a writer, your days in what's he say? Your days in polite society are already over, or something like that. And I was just thinking about that. Like, this is so confessional, and like all these like details that are so taboo that you're not supposed to talk about, and he's actively engaging with them. And how and using details from his own life, like it's interesting to think. Like, to me, it's like it's there's a certain bravery associated to me with anybody who writes something that is deeply personal and taboo and, reveals a lot about the person writing it like this. And, I don't know, props to him for doing it. So you mentioned just something about his productivity, and I just wanted to touch on it because I find it absolutely incredible. I was looking up because I was like, where did this book fall on the timeline of his publication? Mm-hmm. So let me hit you with them real fast, okay? So 1974, he published Carrie. 75, Salem's Lot. 77, The Shining. 77, Rage. 78, Night Shift. 78, The Stand. 79, The Long Walk. 79, The Dead Zone. 1980, Firestarter. 1981, Roadwork. 1981, Dance Macabre. 1981, Cujo. 1982, The Running Man. 1982, The Dark Tower, The Gunslinger. 1982, Different Seasons. 1983, Christine. 1983, Cycle of the Werewolf. 1983, Pet Sematary. Isn't that insane? He's really insane. It's like that's like averaging 2 novels a year, and some of them are The Stand and The Gunslinger. Like these are massive novels.
Right.
Okay. So then he follows it up: Eye of the Dragon, The Talisman, 1984, Thinner, 1984, Skeleton Crew, 1985, It, 1986. I just had to get to It because I wanted to see where it falls in our range of coverage. Mm-hmm. So he doesn't write It for another 3 years. And he doesn't just work on It after this. He also writes 4 other novels before he writes.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
It's insane. I don't know how I don't know how you switch gears like that so quickly.
He said in the past that he, at one time, was writing 10,000 words a day.
Yeah.
Which is remarkable.
10,000 good words? How much revising does he do is what I want to know.
Oh, well, he says that in his on-writing book, he talks about, like, he believes you should write a novel, you should draft a novel in, like, 3 months, I think. Or he might even say 2 months, something like that. Something ridiculously short. Mm-hmm. Like, he believes firmly in, like, it should happen really fast. And then you put it, and he said his process is he puts it away for 6 weeks and doesn't look at it. And then he pulls it back out after 6 weeks, like he feels he has enough distance, and then revises it.
Insane.
But yeah, so... That's his process. I think it's interesting to know about his process. I don't think that works for every writer. Not every writer works that way. I certainly don't. So at this point where I'm at, I don't write that fast by any stretch. I wish I could because I would finish things a lot faster. But yeah, I mean, that's something, I would be interested to know, like, if his process was always like that or if it changed over time. I know that he said that he's slowed down of late, like he doesn't write 10,000 words a day anymore. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I don't know. It's I do find authors' processes like really fascinating, just so I can like see what I want to try and emulate.
Yeah, that is insane. Just you started and you said Carrie, and then you went Salem's Lot, and then I was like, it's just to write those 2 novels at all, let alone everything else, is insane.
And then he wrote The Shining.
Yeah,
yeah,
it's crazy. And the interesting thing to me is where you put the Dark Tower. I didn't realize the Dark Tower, the one that really started to connect everything, came before this and It. So he had really well established the fact that like everything was connected for the most part, like way before a lot of his major, not a lot of them, but like some of his major novels.
I wonder if we're going to get any of sort of the Stephen King, what's it they call it, the macroverse or whatever. I wonder if we'll get any of that in this novel, or I'll pick up on it if we do. I'll be on the lookout for it.
I feel like we've already got it.
Really?
Yeah.
What did you connect with the macroverse?
If Jud isn't shining, then I don't know what he's doing.
Well, I guess to me that's not necessarily macroverse stuff. That's more just like a greater.
I know what you mean. Okay, like, so you mean like the It like monster?
It's definitely connected universe because we see, or connected world because we see Derry, we hear talk about Cujo, but like, yeah, is there any connection to the otherworldly, almost Lovecraftian, cosmic horror elements that connect a lot of his other novels?
My answer to that would be I'm not telling you.
Okay. Because clearly you know more about this novel than I do at this point. All right, man. So I think that's enough of a stage setting for this thing. Do you want to have some general thoughts before we get into the synopsis?
Yeah, I have some general thoughts. So I wanted to talk about King's foreshadowing and how you feel about it. Because this time I noticed something that I think separates some of his writing from others. And I don't think that it's necessarily... Well, you'll have to tell me because you would know better than me, but I feel that some of the time he is intentionally making his foreshadowing really blatant for the reader. I think a lot of the time you can, because he's having his characters in their minds. It's almost like this is like a retelling, and they're like, at that point, I didn't even realize that the trees would be something that would play a part later, basically.
Right.
So like he's doing this actively throughout the novel, and I wonder if it's to make audience members, one, feel like they're following along, and two, to like build like that dread.
Yes, the latter for sure. I think so what you're talking about is foreshadowing. It's particularly like a kind of foreshadowing, because he's not trying to be coy about it. Like, he
Right.
tells you.
It's blatant. That's what I mean. And it's like,
He
I
tells you,
feel,
like, he says like Norma died 7 weeks later or something like that at one point. Or she would die 7 weeks later.
Before she actually did.
Before she's died in
in
the story.
Right.
Like, he reveals that, and he reveals, other things, he talks about church getting hit by the truck before it happens. Things like that. And when he says that, he's revealing to you something that's going to happen. And I think the effect that creates does create dread in you, because it's an inescapable, it's a horrible thing that is coming. And he's telling you up front that it's going to come. And so it's coming. And so the rest of the time you're reading up until that point, you're like, oh shit, this thing's coming. And it also kind of like makes you want to read to that. You're like, whoa, shit, that's crazy. I want to find out like what happens when that happens. So it has like multiple effects where it works on you, I think, in multiple ways.
He also does, so those are the blatant ones where he out and out says something that happens, but there are other times where he's referencing something that you clearly know is going to come back. Like, for instance, when Jud was telling Ellie not to climb on the logs, and like, because you'll fall off and who knows what's going to happen. That directly tied into that was a red flag. Like, you're like, okay, well, this is an important fact. In the same way that he's like, don't get lost off the trail, and he goes on and on and on about getting lost in the trail and why it would be bad. And you come to realize that if that's going to play a part. And I also noticed like this in The Shining, where with the boiler, it's like creeping. You don't know what's going to happen. Creeps. It's a little more subtle. It's a little more subtle than him telling you out and out what's going to happen. But he keeps talking about the boiler, so you know it's important. Yes. And so he does this like foreshadowing that's blatant. And that's what I was wondering, if it's like, is it for the reader to feel that same kind of dread, I guess.
Yeah. And I think so. It does also have another effect, which I think is an interesting one to analyze, because you don't often see this in movies, because maybe it doesn't work as well. But in telling you that Church is going to get hit by a truck, in telling you that Norma's going to die, it makes it, when it happens, it makes it less of a surprise for you, because you know it's coming. But maybe on the other hand, it also will make it feel less like a twist, right? Like a shocking twist. Oh, shocking twist! The cat got hit by a truck. It's like, no, he told you that was going to happen. You know what I mean? So this isn't a twist. We're like, we all know this is going to happen,
right? And
so when he establishes these things early enough, it's almost like it takes away a little bit of the shock value. But I think the trade-off is for creating the dread and for creating the anticipation of the event.
And I would also say the main thing that sticks out to me is that if he's over here foreshadowing something, when he eventually does something that he doesn't set up and it is shocking, it makes it that much more shocking, because you expect him to set things up and you expect it to show, like, everything to go how you think it's going to go.
So it's also an interesting note real quick that this is also created partially by point of view. This is our first novel with King where it is pretty close POV to one character. We're basically only getting Lewis Creed's thoughts and observations on things, with a little bit of semi-omniscient stuff going on. And then it's definitely also distant, though. So it's close in that it's close to his mind, but it's distant, I guess I mean like temporally. Like you get the feeling that this is Lewis telling us from some future time about something that happened in the past. He's reminiscing about it.
There's a moment where these things keep happening with the character, and I wanted to ask you again if you think that this is like a Shine thing, or if this is like a narrative, like he's trying to do like a disjointed narrative type thing to play with the reader. There's a moment where he's driving to the school, and he goes past the bikers, and he talks about how like bikers and joggers like don't obey the rules at some point, and they're basically just in the way, and they don't care about getting hit. And then he's like in the office, and when the kid comes in who got hit, he talks about how it was almost expected, like he was almost expecting this to happen on his first day. And I'm wondering if you feel like that's him shining some sort of...
That's King brilliantly playing with the very real phenomenon of like it's not even deja vu, but it's just like a different kind of deja vu that I think everybody has, where when really bad things happen, sometimes you may feel like, oh, I knew something like this was going to happen.
Right.
And yeah, I don't know. It's like a weird phenomenon, and like I think it's unexplained, and I think he can take that inexplicable but real thing and in his world connect it to the supernatural.
Right. And I think that's the exact how you just described that is almost exactly how we describe Shining in our Shining coverage. So it's like you could say that individually with this novel on its own, it was just a coincidence, but also for like big King fans, you could point to that and be like, that's potentially a moment where
and you could talk about like all the kids in It potentially could have like a bit of shine to them too.
Right. Yeah.
And like that's how they're able to do the things they're able to do. So I can see that. But let me get into a little bit of synopsis here, just so we can give us specific things to talk about. I'm going to break this up into several paragraphs here. All right. So opening up the novel. Lewis Creed, a doctor from Chicago, is appointed director of the University of Maine's campus health service. He moves into a large house near the small town of Ludlow with his wife, Rachel, and their two young children, Ellie and Gage, and Ellie's cat, Church. From the moment they arrive, the family runs into trouble. Ellie hurts her knee after falling off a swing, and Gage is stung by a bee. Their neighbor, an elderly man named Jud Crandall, comes to help. He warns Lewis and Rachel about the highway that runs past their house. It is constantly used by speeding trucks. So I think this is just a good opportunity to talk about different characters here. And right off the top, I want to point out Creed and Church, pretty blatant symbols there, right? For faith and Christianity, specifically Creed, Church. Mm-hmm. What do you think he's trying to say with that?
I mean, I wonder, did you feel that this book had more religious elements than his other stuff? Because this one very specifically struck me as, and I wonder if Stephen King was raised Christian or Catholic.
I believe he was. I think that was in On Writing. It's been a while since I've read On Writing, which really gets into a lot of his like story growing up. But I think he was raised in a I want to say Catholic, but I'm not 100% sure. I could be wrong about that.
Because I mean, yeah, clearly there's some symbolism being set up with the idea of the family creed, like what creed would that represent? I'm not sure, but church is interesting because you're taking something that's holy and then you're creating this unholy union when church returns, and and the Church of Christianity is based off of a resurrection, right? Yeah. So you can connect that maybe to the cat being resurrected. There's a moment later on where Lewis is talking to Ellie about where you go after death, and he kind of touches on he goes through kind of like different people's belief systems, and he goes through his own and what he struggled with, and I feel like that's definitely very much Stephen King saying his own views as well. I felt like, at least, because I was just assuming that he was raised Christian and not practicing anymore, and felt the way that the character did about not necessarily there being nothing after death, but not being willing to subscribe to anyone.
Yeah. Well, and I liked how he said, I think in the part you're talking about, he said it goes one of two ways. Either there is something afterwards, or there's not.
Right. And
that's kind of how I feel about it too. And it's like I don't know. I identified with that pretty strongly too, because it's like I'm an agnostic, and I'm an agnostic because I recognize that to me there's no way for me to know what happens. Mm-hmm. And I agree. Either it goes one of two ways. Either something happens or nothing happens. And it's impossible to know.
I also like the moment where he addressed kind of potentially, again, I'm just inferring, and I might just be, blown smoke. But King also has the moment where he talks about how, like, maybe if there is something, maybe each religion, maybe you do get the thing. If you're practicing whatever religion, maybe that is your ending. Maybe that is
whatever
your
you believe is what you get.
Yeah,
that's an interesting thought. Yeah, that is interesting.
Because how many holy wars have there been for people saying I'm right, and then ultimately for it to just be something that maybe we should all just be good to one another, and like who knows what happens after all this is done.
So how do you feel about Jud Crandall? I mean, you know more about him than I do, I guess, so that's probably unfair to ask. But,
specifically in the book.
Yeah.
I like him. I mean, I like I obviously like the fatherly role that he plays, and then to the point that so this is jumping ahead a bit, but up to the point that we've seen, he seems like an honorable type of person. He seems like the kind of guy to do the right thing, and then he does this wrong thing in having Lewis bring the cat back, because he feels in his mind there's this pull, which is another interesting thing that we're definitely going to talk about more.
There's a lot of supernatural pulls and supernatural, like, or almost supernatural, like, compulsions that people have here. And it feels to me like Lewis is drawn to Jud in almost a supernatural way as well.
Well, Jud being pulled to the Pet Sematary, to me, seems like something that doesn't fit his character, which I think is to set up how strong this pull is, and to set up the fact that, like, if you've been there, you can be affected by it, and you'll probably end up having someone you might be a recurring guest in the Pet Sematary. But I mean, Jud overall, I like that he stuck by his values at the very end. When the hardest thing that happened to him could happen, and he lost his wife, he didn't bring the wife to the Pet Sematary.
Yeah, you're right. Well, let's get into the next part of the synopsis here, since we're skipping ahead. Jud and Lewis quickly become friends. Since Lewis's father died when he was 3, he sees Jud as a surrogate father. A few weeks after the Creeds move in, Jud puts the friendship on the line when he takes the family on a walk into the woods behind their home. A well-tended path leads to a pet cemetery, misspelled cemetery with an S, on the sign, where the children of the town bury their deceased animals. The outing provokes a heated argument between Lewis and Rachel the next day. Rachel disapproves of discussing death, and she worries about how Ellie may be affected of what she saw at the cemetery. It is explained later that Rachel was traumatized by the early death of her sister Zelda from spinal meningitis, an issue that is brought up several times in flashbacks. Lewis empathizes with his wife, realizing that the fault of her trauma rests with her parents, who left Rachel at home with her sister when she died. Okay, so we can get into that now. I wanted to ask you, man, and this is going to be potentially kind of personal, but this is a kind of a heavy material, so I want to get into it. Do you remember when you first learned about, like, mortality and that people die and that maybe pets die, things like that?
I mean, I can't recall the exact moment that it clicked for me, but I can remember that losing the first family member that died. I remember being aware of it, and I don't think even at that time I understood fully. You know what I mean? I don't think I was grappling with it. I think it was just like that person was here and then they were gone. And it didn't affect me till I was a little older.
Do you remember losing a pet when you were young?
Yeah. I remember losing a dog when I was about, I was probably like 11 or 12. Yeah. And that was tough. Interestingly enough, I was the only one home when the dog died.
Oh, really?
I think I was about 12, because I don't think my parents would have left me home earlier than like 12 or 13. But so I was the only one home. So very similar situation to kind of Rachel's. I mean, I don't want to say sister, that a pet, I mean, to me, the pet was as important as a family member, but I'm not trying to minimize Rachel's.
I think the book makes a lot of comparisons between pets and people, and how, we feel grief for both. Yeah, definitely.
But I mean, I specifically, I can remember a really weird story that my dad tells of the first time a family member died. This is super creepy, actually. I may have told this on the podcast, actually, but my dad asked me, my grandmother died, his mother, and I was about 5 or 6. And my dad was like, do you want to say goodbye to grandma? Because she had passed. We had been in the room or nearby, and she had passed, and we went in the room, and he was like, do you want to say goodbye? And I was like, I turned to him and I was like, no, I don't need to, because I saw her leave. As in, like, what he got from that was basically, I said, like, I saw her spirit leave, and I said goodbye to her spirit, which I don't remember. It's a story being told to me, but very interesting. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So for me, I think back about, I had 2 pets. Well, I had a cat named Gandalf, Lord of the Rings reference, who died when I was really young. But I don't remember that very well. I was too young to remember that.
This is morbid, but was he gray?
No, he was a black cat. Although he did have, I think he had like white patches and stuff. Then we had a dog named Velvet, who died when I was, I don't know how old. I mean, I want to say I was like 5 or 6, very young. And I remember it being weird because it was like, I didn't really know how to understand it. And I remember being sad, but like other people were more sad than I was because I didn't really understand it. and then I kind of got sad over time as I thought about it more. In reading this book, like, brings up all these memories. I also had a cat named Aslan, who's another literary reference. And Aslan was hit by a car, which I hadn't thought about in a long time until I read this book, that Aslan got hit by a car. I mean, we never knew who was driving the car or anything. So, somewhere out there, someone hit a cat, and you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. It's crazy to think about, that happened. And I will say my parents never lied to me about it. I never got told a story about like a farm upstate or anything like that.
Right.
And I think it's really interesting how he talks about how like children never forget the lies their parents tell them, which I think is a really fascinating line. Right. And I thought back about it, and I was like, I think my parents were pretty upfront with me about death. And like, I think another early death in my family was my great grandmother when she died. But I remember I had a very similar reaction to Ellie with Norma, because I remember feeling like, oh, she was very old.
Right.
And that's what happens to old people.
Right.
Like that was fine. I was fine with it for some reason in that regard, in a weird way, because you're a kid and like you learn certain things, and one of the things you learn is that old people die. So you're like, okay. But, and then that's always different when a pet dies, because you haven't made that connection like they're supposed to, quote unquote supposed to. So anyway, I don't know. That just brought up all that stuff from childhood with me, and I found it's really affecting.
Yeah. The tough part about this story that starts to get introduced is like, once we get the details of what goes, I guess we haven't really gotten enough of the details for us to make a decision on that yet. But I guess maybe tracking going forward, thinking about the grief and thinking about that immediate shock and that immediate reaction, if it's a sudden thing, I mean, either way, but just thinking of like missing someone so much, or some pet so much, that you're like, are you willing to bring them back in a lesser form? Would you like seeing if you would be desperate enough to?
Yeah, I have a feeling that's going to be a big thing in the second half of this novel. I can feel that's where this story's going, right? Because we see it already with Church, who gets brought back. But before we get to that part, I guess there's also all the stuff with the sister and the childhood illness, and she even says that they thought of her as this like dirty secret who was in the back room,
right? And
how she was ill for a long time, and it was this big stress on the family. And yeah, that's to me, that's the kind of taboo stuff that you don't hear talked about a lot. And how Rachel was so young when it happened that she was forced to try and deal with these things that were just, she was not equipped to deal with. And then I also really like how that carries through into adulthood. And we see that like Rachel never really came around on this stuff. Like, it's still an ongoing thing. And I love that. It's like, I feel like Lewis in some ways is in denial about death. And he feels like it's something that is like, quote unquote, natural, and that you can deal with it. And he sees it all the time, and he's well adjusted. Whereas I feel like Rachel is the more truthful character, in that she is still struggling with it. And I think Lewis, I think we're seeing him be put to the test here. Like, how well adjusted are you really?
Well, I think, yeah. And I would say that just in terms of like her being closer to a real character, I think that there's also a middle ground there. You know what I mean? There's somebody who is able to eventually grieve and deal with death versus someone who's like has like unresolved issues with you know what I mean? She's clearly dealing with things that stem from what Lewis is pissed off about which is like her being feeling like it's her fault, or being forced into a situation where she doesn't have the capability to take care of this person. And because of that, it's like something that's being put on her by her parents. It's kind of like almost a lie that her parents put on her in his way of thinking, because he keeps talking about how his mom lied to him about sex, I think, right?
Yep.
And he carried that
where
through.
Babies come from.
Right. So he carried that through, and he's still mad about it as a character here. So you can see something that is affecting her from childhood that's carried through as well. Yeah.
There's also, I think, a lovely observation that King has when he's talking about, lovely in a dark way, I guess, but he's talking about relationships, and he talks about how two people could know each other for years and be married and, feel like they know each other really well, but it's like foolish to think you can truly know a person. And then he talks about how they're having this conversation, and he hits like a cold spot or like dead air or something. He has like a really interesting way of describing it. And then she has a reaction that like he didn't expect. and how he's like stumbled into a like unknown area of this person that he thought he knew.
Right.
And I thought that was so true to life, like how that can happen, you know, and how people can surprise you that you've known for many, many years, and how you can't really truly know somebody.
Right.
Like not to where like that wouldn't happen anymore. I don't know. It's just really smart observation.
Well, yeah, to speak on that, it's like, what would it take? How could you ever think to know somebody fully 100%? And you think like people are married and they're together forever. You still don't know that person through and through, what their thoughts would be in every scenario. Although people like to think that. So yeah, it's a good observation for sure.
All right, let me get to this next bit of summary here. Lewis himself has a traumatic experience during the first week of classes. Victor Pascal, a student who has been fatally injured in an automobile accident, addresses his dying words to Lewis personally, even though the two men are strangers. On the night following Pascal's death, Lewis experienced what he believes is a very vivid dream in which he meets Pascal, who leads him to the deadfall at the back of the cemetery, and warns Lewis not to, quote, go beyond, no matter how much you feel you need to. Lewis wakes up in bed the next morning, convinced that it was, in fact, a dream, until he finds his feet and bed sheets covered with dried mud and pine needles. Nevertheless, Lewis dismisses the dream as the product of the stress he experienced during Pascal's death, coupled with his wife's lingering anxieties about the subject of death. So yeah, what's your take on all this Victor Pascal stuff?
I can't help but bring in some of the movie stuff, which I think at some point we're going to have to do this movie, the first movie, as a bonus episode or something.
Yeah, I think that'd be a great bonus. Maybe we can do that next month or something. Would be cool to kind of revisit after we've seen the new one, go back to the old one.
Yeah, because there's a lot of differences, but Stephen King was he's the screenwriter on that one. So like he made sure that it stayed fairly faithful. But there were changes. So
yeah,
moving past that and only talking about the book, the Pascal stuff, what do you think right now urged him to say his last words to Lewis? Like, did you feel like you got any sort of sense of like what that was coming from or why that was happening? Because nothing's really happened yet.
This is potentially sort of that Lovecraftian element, because it is kind of inexplicable. It's otherworldly. It's is he insane, or did it really happen? And why would he address him by name? This guy didn't know him. And if it's not, see, so I kind of feel like maybe it wasn't actually Pascal talking to him, but some other spirit or some other force speaking to him through Victor.
I think that's what we're supposed to draw from that. But I mean, if calling his name could be explained away by like a name tag, because he's clearly at a job where he might have a name tag. But it just feels like the first moment of anything happening. But nothing's happened. Church hasn't died yet. He hasn't buried Church yet. It's just he goes to work, nothing, and something's already encroaching into his life.
I just love this scene though. This is like death. You know, we get the story from Jud where he talks about how back in the day, death would just like come to your house and, you know, join you for dinner or whatever and bite your ass and all that stuff. And this is like death doing that to him, right? Like this is death coming to his place of work and, you know, a kid dying on the floor on his first day. And one of the reasons why I don't think I could ever be a doctor, by the way. I don't know if I could handle this kind of stuff. And it's wild and tragic, and it's like this presents us with all of the like unfairness of especially an abrupt death and like a young person, and how even this doctor who we've seen talk about how well adjusted he is, you know, like this is the proof that like it can still affect him, and he still grapples with it and doesn't know how to handle it. And I don't know, there's a lot of descriptions about the wounds that are really taboo and feel really real. I think he talked about like he consulted with a doctor to get a lot of this stuff right, which I think shows. It felt true to life to me.
Having Lewis be a doctor is a really great choice to me, because doctors are such authority figures in a medical sense, and a lot of this story ends up with sort of like diagnosing Church as dead when he first sees him. Clearly he was dead, and then he's like self-diagnosing sometimes, which leads to kind of like his denial on a lot of issues. He's like self-diagnosing and saying like, oh, I had a sleeping fit, or I had this, or I had that. And
he's rationalizing.
He's rationalizing these things. And I think that was a great choice.
Yeah, so Lewis is not necessarily like a completely likable character. I think we see some stuff in him. We see some darker things. We see some thoughts that, I mean, at the very beginning, we see him like thinking about just dropping his family off at a gas station and like hightailing it down to Florida and just being like, because he's fed up with them, right? So he's not like a super likable guy in every way, but I like him as a protagonist because he's so rational. And to me, I identify with that. And I love the way that we see him rationalizing crazy shit that happens to him. He starts coming up with all these reasons to explain it. He comes up with like ways that Victor could have known it, or it was an auditory/visual hallucination, and he starts like codifying it. And when he has his dream later, he's like, I was actually a somnambulous moment where I was sleepwalking, and it was mixed with a dream. And like, I love that he's able to break it all down and try and make it seem like it's not actually supernatural. And of course, because it's a Stephen King novel, we're like, well, of course it actually is supernatural. But if it was me in real life, I would totally do that. If some crazy shit happened, I'd try and explain it. I'm sure I would. Let's get to this next bit of summary here. Lewis is forced to confront the subject of death at Halloween when Jud's wife, Norma, suffers a near-fatal heart attack. Thanks to Lewis's prompt attention, Norma makes a quick recovery. Judd is grateful for Lewis's help and decides to repay him after church has run over outside his home at Thanksgiving. Rachel and the kids are visiting Rachel's parents in Chicago, but Lewis frets over breaking the news to Ellie. Sympathizing with Lewis, Judd takes him to the Pet Sematary, supposedly to bury Church. But instead of stopping there, Judd leads Lewis farther on a frightening journey to the real cemetery, an ancient burial ground that was once used by the Micmac Indians. There, Lewis buries the cat on Judd's instruction. Okay, so a couple things there. We talked already about the Norma stuff. I think this is where it is, because it's interesting, because it's like we see Lewis sweeping in and saving her. Mm-hmm. And this moment is robbed of a lot of its poignancy almost when it's dropped that she was going to die like 7 weeks later.
Right.
So you're immediately like, as much as you're feeling all good about him saving her life, you're like, oh shit, well, she's going to die 7 weeks later. And it feels like inescapable too, right?
Yeah.
And that just makes death loom over this whole story.
Mm-hmm. It's constant. Like I said, I did not remember that being such a huge... I remembered clearly there was death, but it's like, it's overbearing sometimes. Like you're just constantly reading about death and like existential stuff about like what happens when you die. And it gets to be a lot. Yeah. So here we are at Judd's decision to try to help, in quotations, help Lewis to bring Church back. And when they go to this place beyond the cemetery, there's this allure to it. There's like this pull that they feel a lot better. He'd been like tired from carrying Church up all the way up miles into this cemetery area, and they're both feeling like really happy, and they're talking about it. And I think it's this like sort of draw to this area, which is part of the reason why I think Judd couldn't not come back, because he's like, oh, I can make this person I can pay back this person who saved my wife's life, while at the same time going back to this area that brought me some joy, or just going there is like a drug or something.
Yeah. Well, places having power is a big like theme in King's work in general, right? Like we see that with The Shining in the Stanley Hotel, the Overlook Hotel. We see that in it with the entire town of Derry. It's, a haunted town essentially. And here I think the Pet Sematary is the haunted place in this story, right? And yeah, it's places having a power and energy to them, I think, is something that King really loves to talk about. All right, so I think I'm just going to read this last bit of summary here, and then we can kind of just go off with anything else that we want to talk about with this first half. Mm-hmm. So Lewis thinks that the subject is finished until the next afternoon when Church returns home. It is, however, obvious that the cat is not the same as before. While he used to be vibrant and lively, he now acts ornery and, quote, a little dead, in Lewis's words. Church hunts for mice and birds much more often, and he rips them apart without eating them. The cat also smells so bad that Ellie no longer wants him in her room at night. Judd confirms that his condition is the rule, rather than the exception, for animals who have been resurrected in this fashion. Lewis is deeply disturbed by Church's resurrection and begins to wish he had never done it. Also, within this section is Norma actually dying. Yeah, let's talk about all of that. Let's anything else it's now fair game for this first.
So the first thing I want to talk about is Judd and his history, and kind of like his introduction to this area and hearing about, I guess specifically hearing about the town and some of the people back in his day when he loses his dog Spot. What do you make of this guy who like is waiting around for the kid? He's like throwing rocks at the window, wanting to bring him there, and he's like the town drunk.
His name was like Sammy or something.
Yeah, and then he's willing to take this kid's dog. It just seems weird that he would want to take this kid's dog to bring it back. But then,
well, and it's explained that it's like the draw of the cemetery. Once you've been there, like
Right.
you're like cursed essentially, and you're gonna constantly bring people back to it. Which in that sense, it's like it self perpetuates. If it creates that feeling in people, like that's how it's continued to be an important place for hundreds of years, is the implication.
yeah,
Which is, it makes it feel like it's this evil place that wants to go on and continue to exert its influence, which is a totally Stephen King thing.
exactly.
Right.
And we learned that the Native Americans felt that the land, what was it specifically? It was cursed in some way, but there's a certain phrase that they use. Do you remember?
The ground is like soil, poisoned or
something like that. It's the idea that the ground has been poisoned, and so that almost leads to, it's not even necessarily the Native American burial that's bringing anything back. You know, it's like the ground has been tainted and poisoned, so it seems like they even say like the Native Americans moved on to another area.
Yeah, and there's talk of the Wendigo, which I don't know how important that'll be going forward, but I think the Wendigo was said to have caused the like desecration of the ground or something.
Yeah.
So maybe there's some sort of creature out there.
Isn't the Wendigo? It's like a northern thing, right? It's like specifically like a northern tale that people.
I was about to talk about out my ass about it, but instead I'm going to look it up. All right, so I just looked up what the Wendigo is. I wasn't 100% sure. It's in Algonquin folklore. The Wendigo is a mythical man-eating creature or evil spirit native to the northern forests of the Atlantic coast and the Great Lakes region of the United States and Canada. It may appear as a monster with some characteristics of a human, or as a spirit who has possessed a human being and made them become monstrous. It is historically associated with murder, insatiable greed, and the cultural taboos against such behaviors.
There you go.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's cool that he took like an existing folklore or an existing myth or legend and like built it into the story, just because it seems like, I don't know, I think each region, like everywhere, I would say everywhere, has like some sort of legend or creature, Sasquatch or Chupacabra. So for him to just take that and kind of at least rumor it and have it be like
cryptids and stuff,
yeah, like have something looming that is potentially a creature when clearly it's just like the demons and the things that are going on are specifically put on by the people who can't fight the urge to bring back loved ones. It's I don't know, it's very Pennywise, right? Like Pennywise is preying on people and like their needs or their fears, their fears, and in this way he's preying on a fear of losing people.
Yeah. What about did you catch you had to have the Maurice Sendak?
Oh my god,
Where the Wild Things Are?
Yeah, I was gonna bring that up.
Everything connects to our podcast, man. Another project we covered.
At some point, what's the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon? At some point we'll be able to 6 degree of ink to film, and just anything like in some way we'll be able to connect one project or one specific thing to something we've covered.
Specifically, the Where the Wild Things Are was referenced in like another book we were reading recently, right? Can you remember what it was?
Wow.
Because I can't. So
I think I do remember it being referenced. Yeah. What was that? I can't remember, but I do want to say the way that it was
listener,
referenced.
if you can remember us talking about it, definitely send us an email, because I would love to know, but I'm not going to like listen to all our old episodes to find it.
So
but I know we talked about it in another project not that long ago.
The way that the reference was dropped originally was during that scene where Pascal is dying. He said like as soon as he's dead and like all the people showed up, he said like the wild rumpus begins or something.
Let the wild rumpus begin, yeah.
And I was like, oh my god! And he's like in the immortal words of Maurice Sendak or something like that. Yeah. And I was like, and he said like it was like in the words of Maurice Sendak, and I was like, why is that name familiar? And he's like, let the rumpus begin. I was like, oh my god! Where the wild things are reference.
Yeah.
And he keeps referencing it actually because it's Ellie's favorite book.
Yeah. So as far as general thoughts go, I have two more that I want to touch on. I'm going to save the biggest for last. But the first one, and then if you have any, you can hit me with them too. The first one is how this story to me feels very classic horror or traditional horror in many ways, which can in itself, a lot of traditional tropes can have some like problematic stuff associated with them. But to me, this is like the classic tale of like the city folk going out to rural America and getting involved in some like ancient crazy mysticism shit that, you know what I mean, tears their family apart. So in some ways, it's a lot of like the fear of the big city folk of rural America.
Yeah.
So I feel like that trope is inherently problematic, obviously. Again, you're sort of othering, maybe people who live in poverty or have a different, grow up differently than you. But it's also got a classic feel to it too, right? To me, this, in a lot of ways, this feels like the more like stereotypical king story. If I just like think about what a king story is from like a macro look without talking about specific story specifics, I would think of this kind of story.
Right. Or at least like a family transplanting to another city. That's like the basis, got to be the basis of like at least half his novels.
Well, transplanting to another place.
Right. Another place. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good observation. I think it works, obviously, because it's just like putting a certain type of person in a different kind of situation. You can put the situation against the person and kind of juxtapose. You can learn a lot about the character very quickly.
Well, it's fish out of water too, right? Because they're new there, so they're able to experience this stuff for the first time and also be like, this is weird. Like, why is this way? So it makes you feel less odd for feeling that way too, because you're not familiar with this setting and these people.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's actually funny because I spent a lot of time in Maine as a kid, because my grandparents have a property in Maine, and my family would go visit them, and so I was actually around a lot of people in Maine who spoke in the way that his characters speak in this novel, and so it's actually like a really weird nostalgic thing for me whenever I hear that Maine accent, that Mainer accent. It's very evocative, and outside of King, I feel like you don't see a Maine accent in a lot of places.
Yeah, you can tell how much he loves that area. I was listening to the beginning of the audiobook with Caitlin, and she mentioned that like it's like Michael C. Hall is the narrator in the audiobook, who plays Dexter.
It's funny because I listened to part of the audiobook, but I didn't realize it was him. Wow.
Yeah, he plays Dexter, so it's kind of a great voice for this audiobook. And she mentioned just the way that he was killing the accents, like he was really going in on the main accent.
Yeah, no, it sounded good in the parts that I listened to, because I have a physical copy, and I was kind of bouncing back and forth between the two, but I did listen to some of it, and I agree. Yeah, he was nailing the accents. So there's also something else that I recognized here that I talked about in other episodes with King, and that's his fondness for repeated phrases. Did you pick up on that with this one again? That's something we highlighted in past episodes.
Yeah, I can always.
And here it's the Oz, the Great and Terrible, and like that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
He says it over and over again, and like he loves to do this, and it's cool. Like it's like, to me, it's a marker of his writing that I didn't think about until we started studying it for the podcast. Mm-hmm. How he likes to pick these little phrases and repeat them, and then the repeated phrases shift over time, right? And they'll come back and they'll go away and they'll be replaced by a new one.
It has some sort of thematic element to it. Like it's
not
every
just
time
he brings it back, it means something slightly different,
right,
in relation to the scenario.
Do you feel anything specific with the Oz, the Great and the Powerful? Is it Great and Powerful?
Great and
or
Terrible.
Terrible.
Yeah, it's the mispronunciation with the W's. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, because it's like, it's just something that like a kid says, but it keeps. I think maybe just like the particularness of it keeps coming back to our character.
So I mean, just in terms of not even necessarily the pronunciation, but the idea of Oz, and like what does Oz do in The Wizard of Oz? He's like a behind the scenes string puller, making you think he's more powerful, or making you think something else is going on. So I would just say like maybe something.
There's like inherent lies there, right?
Yeah.
I like that. Well, I have one last big thing I wanted to get into, but I was saving it for the very end. It's a little bit like, so I never know how much to talk about like personal stuff on these podcasts, because it's like people come to listen about the book, not about us. But to me, this like really strongly connected with the loss of my mother. And so I just want to talk about it a little bit in the ways that I was thinking about it. So she had brain cancer and was sick for years with it. And it was a tough thing for our family to deal with. And I think there is a lot of like weird feelings surrounding like how much of a burden it could be at times, and how it was this constant thing we were thinking about. And the way he talks about Rachel's sister felt really true to me in a lot of ways, not in every way, because it's obviously different. You know, Rachel's sister was a child, that sort of thing. But then also like the way Rachel felt like she didn't know how to handle it, and she didn't know how to feel, and she was too young. And I remember feeling that way too, even though I was, you know, an adult when it happened. I still remember feeling like, I don't know how to handle this. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. There's no like many things in life. There's like a way to go, and there's like there's a kind of like a blazed trail that you can follow.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, in that way, there is nothing. You're just kind of like left without any direction. And so that connected with me strongly. And so that was also going on through my head while I was reading this. But then to bring it back, you know, away from something so somber, is that I also felt a connection to my mother through this book, because she was a huge Stephen King fan. I don't know if we've talked about this or not, or on the podcast or not, but she loves Stephen King. And I think she read like every book he wrote. Mm-hmm. Maybe she missed a few. I don't know. And I was never really, like, I did not read Stephen King until I was much older.
Right.
I was more into fantasy when I was younger, and she read these like horror novels that were, which is interesting because I loved horror when I was like really young, but I loved like scary stories to tell in the dark and stuff like that, like more almost like kid horror, where she was reading this like serious adult stuff. And I remember thinking while I was reading this, like how there's a part where he's talking about history and generations, and how these young kids in the Norma's family are kind of disconnected from her, and maybe they'll like politely listen to her stories, but she's like a different generation than them. They have other things that they want to do, and how it can be kind of sad, the generational divides, and how I think there's even a line where he talks about people being God's envelopes with like letters. And then like, you know, like a letter is the person. And then once the letter's read, you like put the envelope away, you file the envelope away. And that's like when people die.
Right.
Which I thought was a really interesting metaphor. And he was talking about like the connection to the past. And one of the ways that I think we can connect with the past that I really like is through reading stuff like this, right? And we can connect with people who lived in a different time, and people who were dealing with similar things, but maybe thought about it in a slightly different perspective,
right,
than a modern one. And so literature, in that sense, is like a connection for us, between us and the past. And specifically, King's literature to me is a connection to my mom, because I can think about her reading this novel,
right?
And like, I don't know when she read Pet Sematary. I don't know how old she was, but I can think about the fact that she read this novel and probably thought a lot about death and, you know, the connection to different generations and all that stuff. And I don't know, there's just something that I really enjoyed and was moved by in connecting like my reading of this with her reading it at some point in the past that, you know, I don't know. So I just thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
And I wanted to share that.
I love that, man. That's, yeah. The idea that it is kind of this shared experience, even if it's not currently, it's somebody went through something that you're currently also going through, and it's like an exact shared experience. And I don't think you can do that with anything except, I mean, you could do it with a film as well, but other than stories, there's no way to really have the same exact experience as someone else. And like through that way, you're having the exact same, down to every word is read the exact same way.
Well, there's something very intimate about reading a novel that you don't get from a film. And I know you're a big film guy, and I'm not, it's not to say that film can't provoke thoughts but I think there's a much less reflective element during most movies than there is when you're reading. Because when you're watching something, you're often a passive observer of it. And then maybe you reflect about it after it's over. But the process of reading a novel, reflection is happening constantly.
Right.
Like you're reading a line and you're thinking about it. You're reading this observation and you're thinking about it. And so in that sense, like it's a more interactive medium, just like interactive with your own mind, if that makes sense.
Well, I think it's just, like you said, it's the downtime that you have in between. So it's like, for a film, the way that you achieve that is like repeat viewings. But from what you're saying is like, I totally get what you're saying, because you can't, other than pausing a movie, which is, you're messing up the flow of what the filmmaker intended. There are brief moments in a film where I applaud directors who build in moments of reflection in their films, because I think that you need that and you can draw a lot about a character or a lot about a situation. But I understand what you're saying. Like, I definitely agree with you.
Yeah, like showing an exterior or showing like setting where nothing like actively is happening, that could give you a moment to like come down off of a scene, right?
Having a character clearly contemplating, having a moment of levity between something more serious that's going on. But yeah, the idea, that's what I mean, that's just a difference in medium. The idea of a book is you can take it as quickly or slowly as you want and really process it. And I mean, advantage to both mediums. Like, it's just storytelling in general, I think is really interesting in that way, because then that's where our podcast really crosses over too. It's like we try to see how people are able to take something like a book where you're supposed to get so many things out of it and then cram it into a 2-hour film, and then you can reflect on it a lot afterwards. But when it's currently going on, you catch as much as you can and then maybe check it out again later.
Yeah, and in writing, one of the ways that they can do that is with line breaks and chapter breaks, right? Like that, there's all these built-in spots where it's like asking you to stop and take a moment and think about what just happened.
Yeah, well, and like a massive film obviously would have like a
intermission,
right? And like that's an old school thing to do, but intermissions were for that reason. They were so long and to allow people to have like 15 minutes to process things. But I did really quickly want to go back to you talking about your mother, because I've never lost anyone that close to me, but I constantly think about what you guys had to go through with that, and I knew I was thinking about your mom while reading this book, because like I'm close to your family, and like I like know of some of what you guys went through. So for me, in order for me to kind of comprehend, to even like begin to imagine what it's like to lose someone like that close, I mean, I was thinking of like how you guys must have had to deal with it, and how what emotions it would. I was like, what is Luke going to be getting from this based on his experiences? And
whereas I was thinking like, what did my mom think when she read this part?
Right.
You know, like I would love to know, you know, like what she thought about a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
And because we thought differently. She was a very religious person, so in a lot of ways she felt a lot differently than I did. But also, like, when in her life did she read this, and had her feelings about death changed over time? Well, I don't know.
And that's not to say that like even someone of faith can have a similar. I guess what I'm trying to say is, even people of faith have like doubts, and they think about, you know, they constantly are thinking and weighing their faith, and it's something that people with faith struggle with. So it's like she could have very well had the same exact thoughts as you were having, like, what is existentially, what does happen when we die? Like, clearly she had a certain thing in her head, but maybe she was weighing other things.
Well, I think most people with faith have doubts. I think it's kind of like that line in was it Game of Thrones, where he says, you know, can a man be brave if he's scared?
Right.
And, you know, Ned says a man can only be brave when he's scared. And I think you can only have faith in something that you have doubts about, I think, probably, right? Like, faith is the answer to that. And whether or not you feel it, I think will affect how you feel.
I think it's the healthiest way. And like, I have certain thoughts about religion because I was raised in a religious household, but I think from what I saw, and I also identify agnostically now, because for me, there's a lot of like ritualistic things that go on with religion, and kind of, manipulation, and like historically there's a lot of stuff that I just don't, and there's just a lot of things. We don't have to get fully into it right now, but basically having seen a lot of religious people, I think the healthiest way is to have a certain amount of doubt, and like believe in what you believe in, but also be willing to think in different, you know, be willing to pivot and think differently, and stick to your faith, but also like don't do it blindly.
And sometimes that rigidity of faith and the inflexibility and the unwillingness to admit doubt, I think, can be indicative of like a defense mechanism, honestly.
Right.
It's like at some point the prospect of death terrified you so profoundly that you armored yourself with this faith, and now you can't possibly admit that there could be any doubt there, because to admit that is to engage with that fear again. And people are unwilling to do it. And I think, you know, totally understandable, because I really believe, and some mortality and stuff is something that comes up a lot in my writing, and, you know, a lot of stuff that's unpublished too, but, you know, hopefully we'll find the light of day soon. And yeah, it's I think it's like one of the biggest things, you know, that people talk about all the time. It's like one of the biggest things we all deal with. It connects us all, and it's a shared experience. And yeah, I think, I think this novel touches on all of that in all the right ways.
Okay, so I have an idea for something that we can do. I want to see if you can try to shoot out some predictions of what's going to happen in the second half of the novel. Some things I feel like are clearly being set up, but I want to know what you think might happen here at the end for next week.
Okay, so we're going to save that for the very end?
Yes.
All right, we wanted to thank one of our oldest and most loyal supporters, Chris C. He's been with us since the very beginning, huge supporter of ours. We love him. Shout out to you. If you wanted to find out how you can become a patron, go to patreon.com/ink2film. You can get access to bonus content and all sorts of other little goodies that we offer our patrons.
Connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All of those are at ink2film. And we have a Facebook group called the Council of Inklings, which we're pretty active on. We post polls. Luke posts a lot of updates about upcoming adaptations and stuff.
I'm very active on there.
He's constantly posting that kind of stuff. You got
to get on there a little more, man. We got to get you interacting on there a little more.
My thing is, like, I just assume that you've already posted. I see news. I see lots of adaptation stuff, and I'm like, he's already put it in the group. It's fine. But yeah, so, I mean, I am there. So if you tag me, if you say anything in there, I see all of the posts in our Council of Inklings. So.
You're more of a lurker in the group.
I'm quite a lurker, yeah. I hang out there though. So yeah, if you wanted to join that group, that would be awesome, and you can also influence kind of some of our decision making going forward for projects.
Yeah, and that's the Council of Inklings on Facebook. Definitely come join that. It's a cool place to be for this podcast. And yeah, if you wanted to reach out to us just directly, you can always send us an email to ink2film@gmail.com and let us know what you thought of this episode or about our King coverage in general. And yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
Leave us a rating or review on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps us out, and it gets our podcast higher up those charts and helps get our name out there.
Yeah, and it's a great way to let us know that you enjoyed this episode. So definitely shout it from the mountaintops if possible. We wanted to thank Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music, and Jennifer Delazana for providing our transcripts.
All right, so this is it here. We're going to talk about your theories, your predictions going forward. I feel like you have a pretty good basis for Stephen King's writing, so I'm wondering where you think this will go.
It's tough, man. This is a tough. So, like, the one thing is that at the end of the part we read, it's revealed that Gage Lewis needed to be worried about trucks in regards to Gage. So, like, I can predict Gage is going to get hit by a car. I can see that coming. It's basically confirmed by the text. Knowing that that's going to happen, the next logical thing is that Lewis is going to try and bring Gage back to life using the Pet Sematary. And we've already seen that we've seen that animals brought back to the Pet Sematary are wrong in many ways. So I think we're going to get like a zombie kid who's been brought back. And I kind of think that we're going to progress, and that maybe the kid will grow with them some, and we'll see like how him being wrong affects their family dynamic. I am really curious to know, because there was a moment when he's talking to Jud where he says that he felt like Jud was lying when he said that he had never done it. And so I want to know, like, was Norma brought back at some point, or was Jud himself brought back at some point? I'm really curious to see where that goes. And man, I think it's going to go bad. I think we'll see the Wendigo. That would be cool. But yeah, I think stuff's going to get crazy. We're going to get zombies essentially, or these like off resurrected beings. I think Rachel and Lewis's relationship is destined for bad stuff. I think Rachel is not going to be okay with him bringing back the child, and that's going to cause a lot of friction. And yeah, where it goes from there, honestly, I'm just really curious to know. I don't know where it's going to go, and I'm excited to read it.
A couple specific questions for you based on your theories. What's going to happen at church?
That's a good question. I think he's going to try and kill the cat again, a second time. And I don't know if it's going to stay. I don't know if it's going to stick. But yeah, I think he's going to try and kill the cat again.
So you, for any reason, do you think? Okay, yeah.
Oh no, yeah. I think Church is going to like attack Ellie or something. Like he's going to do something.
Okay, how creepy was that moment where it was in Gage's room and he tried to like shoo it out of there, and it was like wouldn't leave. It was like in Gage's closet.
when he woke up and Church was on his chest, like purring, and that was the only time the cat purred.
Crazy.
That was creepy. I like
creepy
that.
stuff. All right, and then another question: do you think if Gage is hit by a car and killed, do you think that there's a funeral and everything goes down, or do you think that Lewis just takes the kids straight to the cemetery as soon as it happens? Ooh. Do you think that Rachel ever knows, do you see what I'm saying? Like, do you think that he just takes Gage there and puts him straight in the cemetery?
This is going to be wrong, but I can foresee Lewis telling Rachel about the pet cemetery after Gage gets hit, when Rachel is like overcome with grief. And then her like okaying it, and then him doing it, taking Gage to the pet cemetery, but then her like, or maybe both of them had just having a change of heart afterwards. But I think more strongly her, like I think she's gonna okay with it because she's gonna be so grief, stricken that she's gonna be reaching for anything. And then when she's faced with the reality of it, I think she's gonna regret what they did. And yeah, man, it's gonna be dark.
I mean, we've already seen her unwillingness to accept death, so we'll see how it goes.
That's true. All right, man, I'm excited to get into the second half of this novel. We hope you join us next week for that. And until then,
thanks for listening.